Hi, thank you for joining us for this week's presentation. This one will be a little different than the way we've done it before. We're going to examine the fall of communism and Reagan's role in that throughout the 1980s. So we're using Prezi, which we've used before, but I wanted to point out a few things before we start. First, you see this word map that we have from a specific speech of Reagan, and the words he used most, of course, on a word map are depicted larger. You can also see that it's in the shape of the world. And what we'll do as we move through these places in the United States, in Europe, and in Moscow, we'll zoom into those parts of the world. So I think it's kind of a cool way to go about doing this. We'll also see some video clips that will hopefully, fingers crossed, be linked and play while I'm talking. There will be links to those. And then we'll also have some documents that will have several questions where I'd like you, when you get to it, to pause and kind of think about those before you resume playing. So, with all that said, let's begin. This was created when I was in grad school 10 years ago. Hard to believe, but I really enjoyed this a lot. And it's, of course, been updated pretty much every year since then. So, without further ado, let us begin. All right, so Reagan is running for president in 1980, and he's in Cleveland, Ohio, giving a speech the night before the election when he asks this famous question of his.
Next Tuesday is election day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you will vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
So Reagan boils these economic issues of the 70s to one simple question. Carter had been president. Carter is trying to get reelected, and Reagan's running against him. Carter says, "Hey, I'm doing a good job. Things are getting better." And Reagan says, "Hey, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And the truth is, most people weren't. So we know that the economy is most often the thing that gets or loses the presidency for someone. So, okay, what could be his new direction for the United States? What does it sound like Reagan's offering? Take a moment, hit pause, and think about that. He seems to have a financial alternative. It wasn't in the clip, but his economic policies were very different than Carter's. And so those will be things that he will institute once he does become president. We're going to focus more, however, on the foreign side of things in this lecture. Okay, so now we've flown to Washington, D.C. We can see our map of D.C., and let's see what comes up next. So we have spending. Remember, the Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a Cold War, and part of that was the arms race, right? Well, something Reagan decides to do is to build up our military. Look at this graph. You can see how much defense spending went up under Reagan. And if you compare that with the big events before and after, what's different? Those other three events were wars, right? We weren't in an actual war when Reagan was president. There was the Cold War, there was that tension, but Reagan decided that if we had enough strength, if we had enough intimidation, that the Soviet Union wouldn't dare attack us. So he funds the military greatly during his presidency. How do you think he would justify that increase? Take a second again to pause. He says it's necessary, right, for to keep us safe. What do you think that might have to do with Cold War tensions? What might the Soviet Union think as they see us building up our military even more and more? Would they be worried? Would that make a conflict more likely to happen? Okay, speaking of the Soviet Union, we've flown all the way to Moscow now, and let's see what they're saying about Reagan and his buildup. Now, this is a secret meeting between the Stasi, which is the East German kind of secret police, and their Russian counterpart. As we scroll down, we'll see, check out this very bottom part. The US is preparing for war, but is not willing to start a war. They are not building up the factories and places in order to destroy them. They strive for military superiority in order to check us and then declare checkmate against us without starting a war. This is what they want, but we will not allow it. Okay, so the Soviet Union and their East German counterparts see that, and they're like saying, "Okay, we're gonna fight back too." Okay, we've flown all the way to Orlando, and we're going to see a speech that Reagan is giving to a religious group. In this speech, he's going to talk about the backwardness of the Soviet Union. And how we fight this idea of a nuclear freeze. The problem with live stuff on YouTube, it doesn't work. Basically, what Reagan says is that some people are talking about freezing production of nuclear weapons, and that the Soviet Union would do that too. And he says that we can't do that. He says in that third paragraph, well, in the first paragraph, a freeze now would be dangerous for us, for the US. He says we can't freeze the Soviets' desires to spread communism. In the third paragraph, he says a freeze would reward the Soviet Union for what they're doing. So he's saying, no, let's not do that. Let's keep building up our military. So it really sounds like Reagan wants to take on the Soviet Union, right? In this speech, he also uses a famous phrase. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. It's pretty clear what he's saying there, right? The focus of evil in the modern world. Doesn't sound like our relations are going to be too good anytime soon, right? Why do you think Reagan would take this provocative stance in 1983? Think about what would be happening the next year in 1984. We have an election, right? That's for your Stranger Thing fans there. 84 was Reagan's re-election year, so that'll be Reagan with George Bush as his running mate. No surprise, or maybe it is a surprise, spoiler alert, but Reagan does win. Here he is talking about the military budget. You know, you want something to work and it doesn't work. That's okay. We have exactly what he says right here. In this speech, he's talking about to the American public the need to build up our military. And look what he says. He says, we haven't built a new long range bomber for 20 years. Now we're building another one. We haven't had a new strategic submarine in 17 years. Now we're building one new one a year. He says our land-based missiles are better, but the Soviet Union has them too. So we need to keep building up and building up. the Army is getting its new tank, right? He says the Air Force is modernizing. So basically, Reagan says that all of these things cost money, but that they need to happen, right? Because of his buildup, because he wants to be able to fight the Soviet Union. Now, think about when we spend all this money on the military, what else do we have to weigh? So, pause for a second. And we have two choices, right? If we're going to increase our military spending, that means we're either going to need to decrease spending somewhere else, or we're going to incur more national debt, right?
There is a bear in the woods. There is a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
All right, so I jumped the gun earlier. That was Reagan's 1984 reelection, one of his ads. What does the bear represent? The bear is the national symbol of the Soviet Union, of Russia. The tone sounds very serious, right? There's a bear in the woods. Some people can't even see it. But if it's there, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear, right? You have that heartbeat going in the background. So, pretty intense commercial. It seems to preview maybe a stronger stance against the Soviet Union in his next term if he wins, which we already said he will win. Okay, we're going to fly back to DC, and now we're going to see some of Reagan's inauguration.
There is only one way safely and legitimately to reduce the cost of national security, to reduce the need for it. And this we're trying to do in negotiations with the Soviet Union. We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth.
Okay, so it's interesting to think, right? What's different about Reagan's tone in this inaugural speech than what he had been saying in his election campaign? In his election campaign, he was super tough on the Soviet Union, right? Now we literally just heard him say, "We're going to seek to eliminate nuclear weapons and all nuclear weapons." That seems like a big about turn of face, right? We didn't watch that clip, but the other thing he proposes in here is something called a missile shield that would protect us from incoming nuclear weapons. And this would be a missile shield based on satellites in space. That shield will famously get the name Star Wars after, right? The movie that had just been out. I guess they were on their second one of the franchise by that point. So there's two big things that Reagan proposes in there, but really there's a shift. So it's kind of like why might he want that shift? Why do presidents want once they get reelected? Why might they change their tone? One reason why is because once they're elected to their second term, never have to get elected again, right? They never run for office again because they can no longer be president. So perhaps Reagan felt freed up to now approach policies like peace that he could not before. Okay, so zooming out now, we're going to go to Moscow, and there will be a new leader in Moscow, and we're going to hear about this guy. This guy is named Mikhail Gorbachev, and Gorbachev is the general secretary of the Communist Party. And in here, he has some plans called perestroika. This is how he wants to make the Soviet Union a better functioning economy, more efficient. And perestroika is the crisis. So we can take a look at just his first paragraph. He says that Soviet society is ripe for change. They've been yearning for it. Um, he said that it's kind of interesting, right? The Soviet Union is the world's biggest producer of steel, fuel, energy, yet they're short on those things because they have a lot of waste. So he's going to propose some changes that he thinks will make the Soviet Union better. Maybe some that are a little less communistic, get where it's less controlled by the government, and maybe giving some of these freedoms to companies inside of the Soviet Union. Now, he says they're not getting rid of communism, or they called it socialism in the last paragraph. He says, we're going to make this better. But then look at the last sentence. We want more socialism and therefore more democracy. So he wants to give more power to the people. That's kind of interesting, right? It sounds like not only does the United States have a recently reelected leader with a new way of thinking, but so does the Soviet Union. So, what does that mean for our relationship? If there's two people open to reforming things, then maybe it'll get better, right? This is a great political cartoon. Take a look at it for a second. This mechanic, Perestroika Motors, has taken the car apart. Now comes the tricky part. What do you do? How do you improve it? How do you make things better? Can you put things back together? Okay, so now we are in West Berlin. We're at the Brandenburg Gate. West Berlin was the democratic capital of West Germany, as you remember. It had been divided that way since after World War II. East Berlin was the capital of East Germany, which was a communist nation, right? East Germany was supported by the Soviet Union. So Reagan is giving a speech with the Berlin Wall right behind him, and behind that is the Brandenburg Gate. This gate had been open, it had been a historic landmark in Berlin for centuries. And so Reagan is giving a speech at this gate at the Berlin Wall, and he's going to have one of his most famous lines ever, maybe even in the history of presidential rhetoric.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Sorry for the buffering there, but we have right up ahead his most famous line, tear down this wall, because the wall was put there, right, by the East German government, which was under the power of the Soviet Union. So Reagan is encouraging Gorbachev, right, to do something to make the world a better place by tearing down that wall and tearing down, presumably, communism. Okay, so what we're going to see now is a Happy New Year message from 1988 from Reagan and from Gorbachev. And this one is kind of interesting because what this is it's a New Year's message from President Reagan to the Soviet people, and then it's a message from General Secretary Gorbachev to the American people. So we've had a cross cultural New Year's Eve exchange of messages, which is pretty interesting and remarkable. So let's take a look at what they say.
Good evening. This is Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. Union on the occasion of the new year. I know that in the Soviet Union, as it is all around the world, this is a season of hope and expectation, a time for family to gather, a time for prayer, a time to think about peace. That's true. At this time of year, Americans traveled across the country in their cars, by train, or by airplane to be together with their families. Many Americans, of course, came to the United States from other countries, and at this time of year, they look forward to hosting friends and family in their homelands. Most of us celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah, and as part of those celebrations, we go to church or synagogue, then gather around the family dinner table. After giving thanks for our blessings, we share a traditional holiday meal of goose, turkey, or roast beef and exchange gifts. On New Year's Eve, we gather again, and like you, we raise our glasses in a toast to the year to come, to our hopes for ourselves, for our families, and yes, for our nation and the world. This year, the future of the nation and the world is particularly on our minds. We are thinking of our nation because in the year ahead, we Americans will choose our next president. Every adult citizen has a role to play in the making of this decision. We will listen to what the candidates say, we will debate their views and our own, and in November, we will vote. I'll still be president next January, but soon after that, the man or woman leading our country will be the one the American people pick this coming November. As I said, we Americans will also be thinking about the future of the world this year.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, as we celebrate the new year, I am glad to address the citizens of the United States of America and to convey to you season's greetings and best wishes from all Soviet people. The 1st of January is a day when we take stock of the past year and try to look ahead into the coming year. The past year, 1987, ended with an event which can be regarded as a good omen. In Washington, President Reagan and I signed the Treaty on the Elimination of Intermediate and Short-Range Missiles. That treaty marks the first step along the path of reducing nuclear arms, and that is its enduring value. But the treaty also has another merit. It has brought our two peoples closer together. We are entering the new year with a hope for continued progress towards a safer.
Okay, so now we've gone all the way to Moscow. Check it out. This is going to be the first time that Gorbachev and Reagan will meet one on one. Gorbachev had been to the US, they had had some negotiations with lots of people around, but this is their first one on one meeting. And this is kind of cool. These were, as you can see at the top, once top secret information, right? It's the what happens with their meeting. So it tells you who's there. And then there's just a quick summary, right? Gorbachev greets the president warmly. He's like, "Hey, it's glad that we can be here again." He said neither side could have done this alone, that the two sides had to do it together. And the president says both had come a long way since Reagan first wrote to Gorbachev in 1985. It's interesting, right? Remember in 83, when running for re-election, Reagan calls them the evil empire. And now in 85, they're meeting one-on-one in Moscow. Gorbachev mentioned that there was a lot to do still, but he's pleased, right, with their first discussion. He hopes that things will continue to go on well. And yeah, looking forward to more stuff. So it's really interesting, right? We see this warming up between these two leaders that at first might have been a little hostile to each other, right? they're both coming in. What's this guy going to be like? Can I work with him? And we find that they're indeed talking. This is Red Square. This is the heart of the Soviet Union, the heart of Moscow, just like Washington, D.C., the mall on Washington, D.C. is for us. And here's Reagan and Gorbachev meeting, right? One on one. Somebody asks Reagan, this is kind of interesting, right? Someone asked him, "Hey, Reagan, remember a couple years ago when you said Soviet Union was the evil empire? What do you think about that?" And in the second line, Reagan says, "You're talking about another time, another era." Now, it was only 2 years ago, right? But there's a change, and that's progress, right? Asked if he still considers Moscow the seat of evil, Reagan answered no. Surprised reporters asked why. So they talk in there. There's this other great line in there. Here it is at the top. Grandfather Reagan, grandma's there, or a woman with her child says, "We want our children to live in peace." Like this kid's just, it's of course maybe a little staged, right? They're just not letting random people walk up to the two most powerful people in the world. But Gorbachev takes the kid out of the mom's arms and says, "Shake hands with grandfather Reagan," right? So you have this, oh, isn't that cute moment that really shows how warm things have become between the two countries. So all in all, right, it sounds like they're with the idea of dialogue, they're working for more dialogue, and only good things can come out of it. Now, we're going to fast forward to East Berlin. And what we see in here is a problem in the East German government. So, clarifying up there, I put in red that there are protests throughout East Germany. The biggest street protests were occurring in Leipzig, but they're spreading. And the problem is that if you lived in East Germany, you were unable to travel for very long to other countries because they were afraid that you would leave and never come back. That's why the Berlin Wall was built in the first place. So they are seeing more and more East Germans leaving and wanting to leave and wanting permission to leave for longer. So that's kind of uh, an interesting change of pace. In the East German government, there's like so many people wanting to do this, they don't know what to do. But they're proposing to allow people a passport for a 30-day trip to anywhere of their choosing. Okay, that's kind of interesting. They're even going to let people go into West Germany, which at the time was would have been unheard of because they were afraid they would have never come back. Now, all this shows that there are these protests and there's demands for change happening in communist East Germany. And it's like, what's going to happen next? Will the USSR, who had been supporting all the communist nations, remember we used the term satellite nation when we were talking about the 50s and 60s Cold War, will the Soviet Union step in and help them out, or will something bigger come of it? This move for greater what? Greater freedom, greater ability to travel. And so we have these famous checkpoints that are throughout East Berlin as you're trying to go into West Berlin or into neighboring nations. Okay, and check it out. Okay, these are the temporary rules for traveling out of East Germany. Travel will no longer be applied until the new travel law comes into force. Starting immediately, the following temporary transition regulations for travel abroad are permitted. Basically, what they're going to do is they're going to let people leave without delay. If you look at letter B there, issue visas for permanent exits without delay What does that mean? That means people can leave East Germany if they want, and the government's not going to hold their loved ones hostage, hold their money hostage to try and get them back. So it seems like things are cracking in the East German government. There's the Brandenburg Gate again. This picture was taken from the West German side of the Berlin Wall, looking into East Germany. But something's about to happen at that wall. We've seen if it works better without the audio. Okay, so we see this festive atmosphere. There's freedom, right? What happens is the East German government basically collapses, and East Germans flee to the Berlin Wall, which before they would have been shot at just for approaching. And now they're able to get on the wall and they start taking it apart, as you can see. The East German military even helps them. So it becomes clear that the East German government is collapsing, and there's hope, at least, that there might be a reunification with the West. That freedom doesn't it doesn't stop. There are other countries that declare their independence from the Soviet Union. So here we are, trick or treat, right? We have Hungary, East Germany, Poland. Those are all communist governments. The people overthrow the governments. They're peaceful revolutions. The Baltics, those are Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They declare that they're no longer communist. And you have these huge changes that occur just in the course of a couple of years, things that have been set in place for decades that people thought they would never see happen in their lives very quickly change. So here's the issue, though. Gorbachev, right? He's the one who instituted these changes. What will happen of him? Will he survive? Thankfully, nothing really happens. If you remember, the Soviet Union was made up of numerous countries. Russia was the biggest of those countries that makes up the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev is arrested, and the next strongest person in the Soviet Union was Russian President Boris Yeltsin. So people are expecting Yeltsin maybe to um, come to power and say, I'm the new general secretary, everybody, right, follow my lead, I'm in command of the army, and maybe institute a harsh crackdown on Russians and other Soviets who were rebelling. But he doesn't. Yeltsin comes to power and he says, you know what, I'm for democracy. And luckily, the army follows him. They lay down the weapons. This coup no longer happens. And throughout all of this, the US is kind of watching scarily, right? Because we're talking about the country that had the world's most nuclear weapons. What will they do next? Um, George Bush, who's president at this time, the first George Bush, watches carefully, cautiously, but eventually things calm down. Gorbachev is freed, but Yeltsin will be the new president of Russia. The Soviet Union will break apart, so Ukraine will be its own country. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, all of those smaller countries that make up the Soviet Union will become their own independent nations. And it really does seem right, like freedom has come for a part of the world that people never expected to see it before. I want to thank you all for watching. This presentation was made by me. Sorry for all the issues with the buffering. I'll link those videos as I post them. Up to you too. Thank you for watching. All rights are reserved. As always, take care of yourselves and someone else. Thank you.